Unresolved Emotional Trauma, a novel by VMS, which travels silently across generation. A novel about love across three generations, 1960, 2000, and 2026. We are in the prologue, the house that inherited silence. Every family believes it begins with a wedding. It does not. It begins with what was never said. In a sprawling government bungalow allotted to an IAS officer, with five children, once ran through long corridors polished by discipline and expectation. Their father stood tall in public life, decisive, articulate, respected. Their mother moved quietly through the rooms, efficient, breathless, loyal. Asthma tightened her lungs and duty tightened her voice. They did not separate, they did not rebel, they survived. Their marriage was not loveless, it was structured, authority, no one said. Endurance on the other, stability without softness. From the house emerged a daughter who learned two lessons too well. Strength means silence, love means sacrifice. Her name was Mira. She grew with beauty and brilliance, a mind sharp enough to analyze the world, a heart tender enough to carry it. She was born into comfort, educated with privilege, and raised beneath ceilings that echoed prestige. Yet inheritance is not money, it is memory. When she chose her husband, she believed she was choosing passion. She did not see she was choosing familiarity, the familiar imbalance of power and familiar emotional asymmetry. He came from poverty and shame, carrying debts louder than affection. He did not know how to stand beside her without feeling small, so he learned to shrink her. She endured not because she lacked intelligence, but because she carried history in her nervous system. For her son, she stayed. For reputation, she stayed. For hope, she stayed. The son grew watching all of it. He watched a grandfather who commanded but did not confess, a father who controlled but did not heal, a mother who understood but did not leave. When he married, he promised himself something radical. I will not repeat them. His wife he entered with modern clarity, education, income, independence. She rejected the kitchen as destiny, rejected sacrifice as proof of love. She spoke the language of equality fluently, but every generation believes it has broken the cycle. The cycles are rarely broken by intention alone, they are broken by integration. This is not a story of villains, not of tradition versus modernity. It is a story of how masculinity reshapes itself across eras, from authority to domination to accommodation to reflection. It is a story of how women evolve from endurance to conscious sacrifice, to assertion to negotiation. And it is a story of a house that looked different in every decade but carried the same invisible inheritance: fear of inadequacy, fear of abandonment, and fear of erasure, until one woman lived long enough to see the pattern return like a boomerang and finally understand it. This is that understanding. The wedding trunk in the attic of the ancestral house sat a teakwood trunk. Inside it were three wedding saris. One smelled of turmeric and jasmine, one of perfume and compromise, one of independence and anxiety. Three brides, three eras, three definitions of marriage. This is their story, the inheritance no one sees. Every family believes its story begins with love. It does not. It begins with survival. Long before the children are born, before weddings are celebrated, before vows are exchanged, there are invisible inheritances moving quietly through bloodlines, unspoken fears, unfinished grief, suppressed desires, unquestioned rules. They do not arrive announced, they arrive disguised as personality, as culture, as duty, as masculinity, as obedience, as sacrifice. In the 1960s, in a modest South Indian household, an officer of Indian Administrative Service believed that responsibility was love. His wife believed endurance was virtue. Between them stood five children, observing silence like oxygen. In 2000, their daughter believed escape was freedom. She mistook mistook intensity for affection and sacrifice for strength, and she fought not society but reputation. In 2026 and beyond, her son would believe awareness was evolution. He would promise himself he would not become his father nor silence himself like his grandfather. He would choose differently, or so he thought. This is not a story about good men and bad women, nor about modernity triumphing over tradition. It is about the quiet architecture of marriage, how it shifts in language, but often repeats in structure. This is about three generations who loved imperfectly, endured differently, and misunderstood themselves in remarkably similar ways. And it is about one woman, Meera, who lived long enough to see that time changes costumes, but consciousness changes destiny. Some stories do not end, they echo, and sometimes, if one person dares to reflect instead of react, the echo softens. And this is the echo. The House of Duty, Part 1, Chapter 1, and the proposal that was not a choice, the visit. In 1960, the word IAS carried the weight of divinity. Swami was not merely an IAS of Indian Administrative Service. He was ambition carved in flesh, tall, short featured, impeccably dressed. His presence filled rooms before his voice did. He believed in law, merit, and discipline. He called a spade, and he paid for that honesty with frequent transfers. It was during one such visit to his elder brother's house that he first saw Noyagi. The year was 1962, though in that house time moved more according to family whispers than calendars. Swami arrived one humid evening at his elder brother's house in Madras, the ceiling fans groaning above them like old men reluctant to speak. He had returned from district duty, still wearing the quiet authority that came with being an officer of Indian Administrative Service. His voice carried discipline, his presence carried expectation. Yet the house was noisy with domestic life. Children ran through the corridor, a brass vessel clanged somewhere in the kitchen, and someone was singing faintly in another room. The voice stopped him. It was not a trained singer's performance, nor an attempt to impress. It was simply a young woman humming while she worked, soft, unguarded, and unself-conscious. Swami followed the sound. She was in the courtyard, singing softly while stringing jasmine. Her voice did not perform, it floated. She had no parents. She lived with a sister, dependent yet dignified. Swami noticed the curve of her concentration, the quiet grace with which she moved. Attraction was immediate. It was not compatibility, it was instinct. She is alone, his sister in law mentioned casually. Good girl, educated, knows music, dance, painting, but no backing. In the dim kitchen stood Naigi. She moved with a grace, quiet, long hair falling over her back, her hands busy arranging steel tumblers on a tray. She had the air of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. She was not the lady of the house, she was the younger sister of his brother's wife and often living there temporarily. Swami watched for a moment longer than necessary. Something about her unsettled him, not beauty alone, though she possessed that easily, but the strange calm with which she carried herself as though she had accepted life's uncertainties long before anyone had asked her to do. Swami made decisions swiftly, and that was his nature. Within months, the wedding was arranged, and no one asked if Noyage loved him. No one asked if Swami understood her. In 1960s, marriages was not about understanding; it was about placement. The next chapter, two unmatched worlds. Swami's world was files, ministers' policy, draft to district inspections, and Noige's world was raga, rangoli, fragile lungs that wheezed at night. He admired intelligence, she embodied art, he valued efficiency, she lived in emotion. The early days had a shimmer And Swami, despite his stern exterior, was unexpectedly romantic. He brought her silk saris from district tours, and he listened to her singing in the evenings. Sometimes he would rest his head on her lap and ask her to hum old kirtis. But romance requires rhythm. Swami was a relentless, career-driven, a pride to a fault. He refused political compromise. Each transfer uprooted Naigi just as she began to feel settled. The government bungalow in which Naigi entered her married life seemed too large for her. Its high ceilings carried echoes, its corridors smelled faintly of polished wood and bureaucratic permanence. Outside stood a garden tended by silent gardeners who saluted whenever Swami passed. To the outside world, the couple represented success, an IAS officer, a cultured wife, respectability lived in every room. In the early months, Swami tried to be attentive in his own structured way. He brought her books, he asked her to sing during evenings. Sometimes he watched quietly as she practiced dance steps in the hall when no one else was around, but Swami loved like a man trained to govern. His affection was disciplined, contained, rarely spoken aloud, and Noigi loved like someone who feared losing what life she had gained. She tried to be everything at once, a perfect wife, a graceful hostess, a daughter in law worthy of Swami's formidable mother, Rukmani. When their first child was born, the house filled with a celebration. Then came another, then another. Life gathered around Naigi like a storm of responsibility she welcomed without complaint. 5 children came in 10 years. Pregnancy after pregnancy weakened her already fragile body. Asthma tightened its grip. Medication in the 1960s was limited, rest was rare. She became slower, breathless, often confined indoors. Swami mistook her fatigue for indifference. She mistook his discipline for emotional distance. They did not fight loudly, they drifted quietly, yet beneath the surface, something fragile was already beginning to change inside her body. Her breathing had grown uncertain. The doctors called it asthma. At first, it appeared only during winter nights. Later, it stayed longer, like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. The weight of 5, asthma did not arrive loudly, and it crept into Naige's life with a small humiliations, a bread she could not finish, a staircase she could no longer climb easily, a sudden exhaustion that made her still down in the middle of household work. 5 children stood fill the house with their competing demands, and Rukmini, the formidable matriarch, watched everything with a mixture of authority and compassion. She understood what her son did not yet fully see, that Noige's body was slowly betraying her. Leave it, she would say when Noige struggled to finish cooking. I will do it, but Noige refused often. Cooking was the one language through which she could still express love without needing strength. Her kitchen smelled constantly of spices, ghee, and slow cooked lentils. She cooked for Swami as though every meal might repair the invisible distance forming between them. Swami noticed her fatigue but interpreted it through the logic he understood best. Discipline, efficiency, responsibility. When the household grew disorganized, when children argued loudly, when dinner was late, his frustration appeared suddenly like a monsoon storm. Words were spoken too sharply, silences lasted too long, neither knew how to explain the growing distance between them. By the 10th year, the house was full of 5 children, noise, expenses, ambitions. Swami's salary supported them all. His reputation remained unblemished but controversial. He refused bribes, he refused flattery, he refused to bend. So he was transferred again and again, and each new town meant Naigi rebuilding a household with wheezing lungs and dwindling strength. Her artistic talents faded into the background. The Veena gathered gathered dust, and her dance anklets were locked away. She became a mother, nothing else. To society, she was fortunate, married to an IAS officer, five children, respectable home, lives in a bungalow with car. Inside, she felt like a shadow moving between kitchen and cradle. Swami loved his children fiercely, but was strict. They feared him more than they adored him. He believed he was shaping them. They believed he was absent. Naiki stood between discipline and tenderness, observing the friction. The next chapter, it is about the transfers. While Noige world shrank slowly inside the walls of the bungalow, Swami's world expanded in more dangerous directions. Government service was rarely simple. Swami possessed a dangerous quality and bureaucratic like honesty without diplomacy. He believed rules should be followed. He believed corruption should be confronted. He believed truth must be spoken directly, but bureaucracies do not reward such beliefs easily. Political pressures mounted, colleagues avoided him, files disappeared mysteriously, transfers arrived abruptly. Every new district meant another house, another unfamiliar environment for the children, another adjustment for Naika's fragile health. Swami carried the weight of these battles home like invisible luggage, but there was no place inside him where that anger could safely rest. And so sometimes unfairly it found its way toward the person closer to him, Naigi. She became the silent receiver of frustration that had nothing to do with her, yet she rarely protested. Not because she agreed, but because survival sometimes requires quite endurance. A marriage of endurance. They slept in the same room but lived in separate climates. Swami longed for admiration, for someone to see the battles he fought in offices where corruption was normalized. Naigi longed for companionship, someone to sit beside her without urgency. He was straightforward to the point of harshness. She was sensitive to the point of silence. Society praised their marriage. Five children so blessed, and I, as family, so respectful. No one saw the absence of laughter. And the next chapter, the man who could not bend. Swami believed truth was clean in his early years. In the IAS, he was posted a district collector in a politically volatile region. Ministers expected compliance, contractors expected favors. He expected law. When a powerful MLA pressured him to clear illegal land allocations, and Swami refused bluntly, I am not appointed to serve you. I serve the constitution. The word spread. The first transfer came within months, then another to the remote district with no infrastructure, punishment masked as administrative necessity. At home, he narrated none of this. He told Naigi only new posting, pack immediately, but inside something began to erode. He was admired publicly, he was isolated privately. Integrity, he realized, was a lonely profession. The next chapter, the air that would not come. Illness has a way of shrinking a person's world. For Naigi, world slowly reduced itself to a few rooms, a few hours of energy, few breaths that could not be trusted. Morning began with hope, and she would raise before the children woke, tying her hair carefully, determined to behave like the woman she had once been, efficient, graceful, uncomplaining. But the body had its own stubborn language. By afternoon, the familiar tightness would begin in her chest, breath would come in fragments, and the kitchen fire would feel hotter than it should. And she would sit for a moment, telling herself it was only temporary. Sometimes Mira, the youngest, would stand nearby watching. Marshall, I helped. Naige would smile faintly. You are too small, Munna. But in truth, she was grateful for the girl's presence. The child has observant eyes, eyes that seem to notice what others unlooked. And on difficult evenings, Naige would lie near the open window, listening to the sounds of the household continuing without her. Children arguing, Rukmani, her mother in law, directing servants, Swami's footsteps returning late from work. The world moved forward, only her breathing struck between effort and surrender. Sometimes she wondered quietly, if my body had been strong, would our marriage had been different? The question had no answer, so she let it dissolve into the night air. And the next chapter, the house that echoed. Noiga's lungs tightened with each transfer. New climates worsened her asthma, and dust, humidity, polluted township. She would sit by the window watching government jeeps arrive and depart, feeling like an accessory to a life she did not live. Her inner voice grew grew louder over the years. I had hands that danced once, I had voice that could fill halls, but why do I now only fill plates? And she would open a veena case sometimes, touch the strings, pluck a note. The sound trembled, not with music but with memory. 5 pregnancies in 10 years left a body depleted, iron deficiency, breathlessness, chronic fatigue. Visitors said, "You are fortunate," she smiled. Fortunate women do not forget the sound of applause. She thought Swami never forbade her art. He simply never had time to notice its disappearance. And Swami's silence, Swami rarely spoke about his inner life. Men in his generation had been trained differently. Strength meant endurance, emotion meant weakness. So he carried his struggles the way soldiers carry unseen wounds. At the office, the atmosphere had grown tense. A development contract had exposed corruption among influential officials, and Swami refused to approve the file without investigation. The consequences arrived quickly: cold smiles, subtle warnings, and abrupt transfer order. His colleagues advised him privately, why create unnecessary trouble, adjust a little. But Swami had never learned the art of adjustment. He returned home every evening with the rigid posture of a man who had fought battles that no one else could see. In the house of a little refuge, children demanded attention. Naga's illness required patience he did not always possess. Rukmani's watchful eyes remind him constantly of his responsibilities. Sometimes Swami walked alone in the garden after a long day and dinner. The night insects sang relentlessly. In those quiet moments, he felt a strange loneliness that success could not erase. A respected officer, father of five, husband of a respectable marriage, yet something inside him remained untouched, unshared, ununderstood. And he would stand beneath the old mango tree and stare at the dark sky, wondering when life had become so heavy. The conspiracy file: 1 year, Swami uncovered a grain procurement scam involving local politicians and senior bureaucrats. The file he submitted was meticulous: dates, account signatures. He assumed evidence would protect him. Instead, it exposed him. Whispers began: "He is too rigid. He doesn't understand political realities. He thinks he is morally superior." A confidential memo labeled him administratively difficult. Transfer number 7 arrived within a decade. This time, Naigi was bedridden. When the order came, Swami, must we move again? She asked softly, wheezing between words. He hesitated. Duty pulled him one way, her fragility another. "I cannot compromise," it said finally, and it was not arrogance, it was identity. Yet that night, lying beside her, he stared at the ceiling long after she slept. "If I bend, I lose myself. If I don't, I lose her strength." For the first time, doubt entered him. And the sisters' house arguments between Swami and Naigi rarely erupted suddenly. They accumulated slowly like dust in corners. The harsh remark, neglected apology, silence stretched too for one evening. The tension finally broke. Details were small, perhaps the children noise, perhaps Swami's irritation after another humiliating transfer. Words were spoken that night. Neither could later remember clearly, but the hurt remained. That Naigi, remember, packed a small bag. Without explanation, she left for her sister's house, taking a little Meera with her. The departure shocked the household. Rukmani tried to maintain composure while the older children whispered anxiously. Swami returned from office to find house incomplete. For the first time in years, he felt genuine panic. By morning, he had traveled across the city. Naiki's sister opened the door cautiously. Inside, Naiki sat quietly beside Meera, her breathing slightly labored, but her expression calm. Swami stood awkwardly for a moment. Anger had already dissolved into something more complicated. Guilt, perhaps not fear. "You cannot live like this," he said finally. Nagi did not argue. She only looked tired, and Swami spoke more gently. "There are children at home. They need you, and perhaps they needed her too," though he did not say it aloud. Within a day, they returned. Life resumed, but something fragile had been exposed. The parallel silences: their marriage was not abusive, it was misaligned. Swami longed for admiration. He wanted Naigi to see his battles. The ethical wars he fought daily. Instead, she saw only his absence. Noyage longed for tenderness. She wanted him to sit beside her without urgency, to ask about her songs, to ask about her exhaustion, and instead he saw her slowing down, her withdrawal, what he misread as lethargy. He began sleeping later, immersed in files even at home. She began sleeping earlier, drained beyond explanation. Two good people, two separate solitudes, and Swami would sometimes watch her from the doorway, thin, coughing children clinging to a sari. And I gave you security, he would think defensively, what more could I have given? And she would watch him reading late into the night. I gave you youth, and she would think quietly, what more could I have become? Neither asked. In 1960s, emotional articulation was not thought. And the next chapter, the secret entered in Mira's life quietly. West Mombalam. She was around 10 when her father began taking her occasionally on evening errands. The drives were long. Destination unfamiliar, modest house in West Mombalam. A woman lived there. She was older than her mother, Nike, with soft eyes and a voice that carried the warmth of someone who listened carefully to Mira. She was simply auntie at first. The visit seemed innocent. Tea was served, polite conversations flowed. But children often understand more than adults expect. Mira noticed the difference in her father's stare, and Swami laughed more easily, his shoulder relaxed. The stern officer disappeared. In his place appeared a man capable of tenderness and love and romance. Once, while the adult believed she was busy with book, and Mira overheard a fragment of conversation. You work too hard, Mr. Swami, the woman said, and you endure too much, Swami replied quietly to her. Something in his voice startled her. It carried a softness she had never heard at home. Mira did not judge, she only watched. And in the strange logic of childhood, she simply concluded, Appa is happy here, and happiness, even borrowed happiness, seemed precious. And the child who watched children growing up in complicated homes often develop a special ability, and they began observers. And Mira was such a child. She learned to read the invisible language of adults, the tightness in her mother's breathing, the impatience behind her father's silence, the unspoken compromise that held the family together. She also learned early that love was rarely simple, and it could contain anger, sacrifice, loneliness, as well as even secrecy. One afternoon, she sat beside her mother Nagi in the kitchen while her mother slowly stirred a pot of sambar. The smell of tamarind and spices filled the room. Amma Mira, suddenly, are you really happy? Nagi paused for a moment. The spoon stopped moving. Then she smiled gently. Happiness is not something we wait for, Mira. It is something we make it with what we have. The answer satisfied the child at the time. But years later, when life tested her own heart, Mira would remember that moment differently, and she would realize that her mother had not answered the question because some truths cannot be spoken without breaking something fragile, and in that house, too many fragile things were already struggling to survive. And the next chapter, the mother's asthma worsened, and chronic weakness settled into her bones. She became withdrawn, what neighbors whispered a sloth. In truth, it was exhaustion. One monsoon every morning, breath failed her completely. Hospital was too for oxygen too late. Naigi died before she turned 50, and it was a premature death. Five children stood confused. Swami stood stunned. For the first time, his decisiveness had no solution. The night the breathing stopped. The night Naigi died began, like many other nights in that house, with the quiet fatigue of the day that asked too much for her lungs. The children had finished dinner. Steel plates were stacked near the sink. The smell of tamarind and roasted spices lingered faintly in the kitchen. Nagi sat near the window where the night air could reach her. Breathing had become a negotiation with the body, one careful inhale at a time. Outside, the garden trees moved gently in the warm Madras wind. Inside, the house was slowly settling into sleep. Rukumani murmured prayers in the puja room. The older children argued softly over school books. Little Mira lay beside her mother, tracing imaginary patterns on the floor tiles. Amasya suddenly, when I grow up, Will I cook like you? Nagi smiled faintly. Yes, you will cook better than me, Mira. Her voice was softer now, thinner somehow. Mira noticed a sound of breathing again, a familiar wheeze that had become part of the house nightly rhythm. But tonight something was different. The breaths were shorter and more urgent. Nagi placed her hand against her chest. For a moment she closed her eyes. The room seemed to grow still, as though even the air understood that something delicate is going to happen. Call your father, Mira, she whispered. Mira ran down the corridor. Swami was at his desk, reviewing files beneath a yellow lamp. The disciplined world of government documents surrounded him like a fortress of order. Appa Amma is calling. He rose immediately, and the bedroom Nagi was sitting upright now, struggling gently for air. Swami had seen her attacks before. He knew the medicines, the procedures, the careful steps required, but something in her expression unsettled him tonight. A strange calm had settled across her face. Bring the inhaler, he said quickly. Rukmani appeared at the doorway, already sensing the urgency. The house that entered a different rhythm. Movements became faster, voices quieter. Nagi tried to breathe, but the air would not come. Each breath seemed to arrive late, as though it had lost its way. And Swami knelt beside her for a man accustomed of solving administrative crises, and this moment felt terrifyingly beyond his authority. Nagi slowly breathed slowly. She looked at him for a moment, brief moment. The years between them seemed to disappear. The early days of their marriage, the hopeful youth neither had quite misunderstood at the time. I tried, she whispered. The words were not dramatic and not angry, simply tired. Swami did not know what she meant, but something inside him tightened painfully. Children gathered quietly at the doorway, confused by the sudden tension. Mira watched everything, the room, her father's anxious moments, mother's fragile breathing, the sound of night insects outside, and then the breaths became even softer and softer until finally there was a silence so complete that everyone in the room felt it before they understood it. Naga's chest stopped moving. Swami waited, sometimes breathing passed during severe attacks. He counted silently 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, but the breath did not return. Realization arrived slowly like dawn light entering a dark room. Rukmani prayer beads fell from her hands. One of the older children began to cry, but Swami remained motionless. He continued holding Naige's hand as though the warmth might still return if he waited. Long enough, the officer who had confronted politicians and bureaucrats without fear now faced something he had never learned to command: laws. After several minutes, he gently lowered her hand. His face remained calm, too calm the children expected shouting or tears. But Swami simply stood there, looking at the woman who had shared his house, his children, his unfinished conversation for nearly 2 decades, and finally he spoke quietly. Go to sleep, Nagi. No one moved. Go to sleep, he repeated. Because tomorrow the world would continue as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Files would arrive, offices would open, and life would proceed with its indifferent rhythm. Only one person would be missing, that is Nagi. The night little Mira lay awake long after everyone else has fallen silent. Through the half open door, she could see her father sitting alone beside the bed where Naik still rested. He did not cry. He only sat there in the dim light, looking like a man who had suddenly discovered that the house he had spent years building contained rooms he had never entered, and at the same time, the rooms had now closed forever. The night of realization, the night her breathing collapsed, was humid. Swami had just returned from a confrontation with a minister who had openly threatened his career. When Naige began grasping, and he was exhausted, furious, and righteous, and Naige began gasping, and the panic stripped him of authority. IAS officer disappeared, husband remained. He held her upright, a call for help, shouted instructions. For the first time in years, he begged Naige, breathe, please, please. In those moments, she looked at him not as officer, not as provider, but as young man who once listened to her singing and begging her to sing. And even never cruel, she wanted to say, just far away, but breath abandoned her before words formed. After her death, the house felt carnivores. Children cried, relatives filled rooms, rituals unfolded. Swami stood still, For the first time, transfers did not matter, files did not matter, integrity did not matter. He had won every professional battle and lost the only witness who might have understood him. The psychological aftermath in the years that follow Swami hardened further, not because he lacked feeling, but because feeling reminded him of failure. He convinced himself, I did my duty, yet loneliness crept into evenings. Retirement stripped him of structure. Without files and authority, he confronted silence. His children respected him emotionally. Intimacy had never been molded, and they kept distance. At 75, he lay in his bed, medals polished in a drawer. He wondered not about his career, but about a Veena gathering dust decades ago. The house that continued despite the fractures beneath its surface, the household continued functioning like old clock whose gears were worn but stubbornly intact. Rukmini balanced the domestic chaos with practical wisdom. Children grew, and school uniforms washed and ironed. Homework was completed under dim lights. Meals appeared on time because Naige refused to surrender the small dignity of caring for her family. One evening, when her breathing allowed, she still sang softly. While cooking, those songs floated through the house like memories of the life she might have lived if illness had not intervened. Swami listened sometimes from the veranda. He never commented, but the music disturbed him because it reminded him of the woman who had once chosen with sudden certainty before life complicated that decision. They lived together for years afterward, not unhappily, not happily either, simply bound by children, duty, and a shared understanding that some marriages continue not because love survives, but because leaving would break too many lives at once. And so the house remained standing, even as something inside it seemed faded. The man who continued after Naige's death, the house did not collapse. That was the strange cruelty of life. Nothing dramatic happened. The sun still rose through the tall neem trees outside the government bungalow, and milk vendors still shouted in the street at dawn. School bells still rang somewhere in the distance, and life continued with an utmost, almost insulting normalcy. But inside the house, something essential vanished. Noige had once began, being the quiet center around which everything revolved. The invisible gravity holding together children, meals, routine, emotion, and Swami. Without her, the house felt like a structure whose pillar were still standing but whose foundation had cracked. Swami rose every morning before sunrise. He shaved carefully, dressed in his neatly pressed khadi shirt, white and white, and prepared for office as though discipline itself might keep the world from his falling apart. The children watched him silently, and they had never seen their father uncertain. Now his silence has changed. Earlier it had been the silence of authority. Now it was the silence of someone walking through unfamiliar terrain. Rukmani tried to fill the void with practical efficiency. Meals were prepared, school schedules were maintained, but the house had lost its warmth. Even the kitchen smelled different. Meera noticed it the most, and she had been the child closest to Naigi during those last years of illness. Now she moved through the rooms like someone searching for a familiar voice that had suddenly stopped answering. At night, she sometimes woke and listened for her mother's breathing, but there was only stillness. Swami at 55, grief does not always appear as tears. For Swami, it appeared as restlessness. Work became heavier after Naigi's death. Political pressures continued, transfer threatened the stability and responsibility of raising five children alone pressed upon him with restless weight. Yet he performed his duties with the same uncompromising honesty. At the same time, the office he remained the formidable IAS officer. At home, he remained the disciplined father. But somewhere between those two identities, a lonely man had emerged. Some evenings, instead of returning directly home, Swami drew through the crowded streets of Madras without a destination. The city moved around him, buses groaning, windows shouting, temple bell ringing. He watched it all with a strange detachment. Then the car would turn almost unconsciously toward a familiar street in West Marlborough. The modest house stood quietly among many similar houses, and no government prestige, no official visitors, only a small veranda and a narrow door. When Swami arrived there, something inside him softened. The woman of his love, and who opened the door greeted him with a gentle smile. Come in. Her voice carried none of the expectation he faced everywhere else. Lakshmi inside the small living room, tea would already be prepared. They spoke about simple things, books, music, occasionally politics, but mostly they spoke about nothing urgent. And for the first time in years, Swami could sit without performing the role of authority. He could simply be a man, the child who understood. One afternoon, he brought Mira with him. Perhaps he believed a child's presence would make the visit appear innocent even to himself. The woman, Lakshmi, welcomed the girl warmly. Ah, this must be Mira. I'm Lakshmi, your auntie. Her eyes were kind. She offered sweets and asked about sweet and asked about her school and about her favorite subject, about what she liked to swing, whether she liked to sing or dance like her mother. Mira answered politely, but as the adults talked, she watched. Children raised in emotionally complicated homes develop a quiet intelligence. They observe tone more than words. They notice pauses between sentences. They understand the language of glances. Mira saw something she had never seen before. Her father was smiling, not the brief formal smile he used with his colleagues or even with her mother, but a relaxed smile that seemed to lighten his entire face. He leaned back into the chair, his voice softened. Even his laughter sounded unfamiliar. For a moment, Mira felt something unexpected relief because the father she knew at home carried the heaviness of responsibility like armor. And here that armor had been removed, the woman spoke gently to him, and you should take care of yourselves. Swami shrugged lightly, and life does not permit such luxury. She looked at him with quiet understanding. Sometimes it must. The conversation drifted on, but Mira had already understood something important. Father was lonely, and in the small house he had found a place where loneliness did not follow him. And the secret without words. As they drew home that evening, the sun was settling over the crowded street. Mira sat quietly beside her father. Neither spoke. Finally, his mommy said, almost casually, "You liked auntie?" Mira nodded. "She is kind." Swami did not reply immediately. After a moment, he said simply, "Yes." The word carried more meaning than the child could fully understand then. And but she sensed the weight behind it. Mira never spoke about those visits to anyone, not to her siblings, not to her grandmother, not even to herself, because instinctively she knew that some truth exists outside the boundaries of right and wrong. They exist simply because human hearts cannot survive entirely alone. The first lesson that she had learned years later, when Mira's own life would fracture under the weight of betrayal and disappointment, she would remember those afternoons in West Bombalam, her father and that auntie Lakshmi. She would remember the look of her father's face when he allowed himself to be human for a few hours, and she would understand something that children rarely learn so early. And marriage does not always protect love, duty does not always create happiness. Sometimes even the strongest men search quietly for a place where their loneliness can rest. And sometimes the children who witness these silent arrangements carry that knowledge into their own futures without fully realizing how deeply it has shaped them. On that evening, long ago, as the car returned to the large government bungalow and where responsibilities waited, Mira looked once at her father. He had resumed his familiar expression of seriousness. The officer had returned, but she knew how that somewhere inside that disciplined man lived another person, someone tired, tender, secretly grateful for the small house in West Mambalam on the lap of Lakshmi auntie, where for a little while he could breathe. And the next chapter, the long after, widower at midlife and NIS officer, five children, no partner, refused to remarriage. My duty is enough, he said. He poured himself into career and fatherhood by raising five children, also hardened him further. Affection became instruction, guidance became command. The children grew, they studied well, fear in the efficient motivator. But emotional intimacy never developed. They respected him and they did not understand him. They moved abroad, married, built their own lives. Swami retired with honor. Speeches praised his integrity. His record was spotless. At home, silence waited. Five demons, as he jokingly called them, his frustration. Rarely visited, phone calls were normal. He had sacrificed youth for stability. He had sacrificed tenderness for discipline. He had sacrificed companionship for responsibility. At 75, he died quietly. In his sleep, no dramatic reconciliation, no grand expression of gratitude, only files, medals, and a house too large for memory. Reflection, the boom of marriage chosen quickly, Compatibility secondary for to circumstance, emotional needs suppressed and sacrificed under unquestioned duty above love. And they did not divorce, they did not celebrate, they endured. Swami gave his life to family, Nagi gave life to motherhood. Neither truly lived for themselves, and yet in their era that was considered as virtue. And end of the part one, the Nagi 1960, the year 1960, Nagi and Swami. Generational psychological truth, boomer marriage reality. Men expressed love through provision, women expressed love through sacrifice. Neither expressed vulnerability, integrity, cost, connection. Art was sacrificed for survival. Swami's tragedy was not that he failed, it was that he succeeded alone. Naga's tragedy was not that she suffered, it was that she disappeared quietly. And the next chapter, the girl everyone noticed, and grief matures children faster than time. After Naigi's death, Mira began to move through the house with a quiet competence that startled even the adults. She worked early and helped Rukmani, her grandmother, in the kitchen. She checked that her siblings had eaten. Rukmani checked that the grandchildren had eaten before leaving for school. No one had asked her about Mira to assume these duties, and she too looked at her grandmother, helped her siblings, though they are older then. And but somewhere inside the 10-year-old, a silent promise had formed. Someone must keep the house from falling apart. So she tried. And years passed. A small child who once clung to Naiga's sari slowly transformed into a young girl of teenage, full of blossom, whose presence drew attention wherever she went. Her hair grew thicker and longer, curly, falling in dark curls nearly to her hips, and it was mesmerizing and eye-catching to everyone in the locality of neighborhood, men and women and everybody we could call it. Her movements carried an unusual grace, perhaps inherited from Naige's artistic temperament. Even her teachers noticed the difference. Such intelligence, one of them told Swami during a school meeting, and such discipline. Swami listened with quiet pride. Among his 5 children, Meera had become something special. Perhaps it was the early burden of responsibility. Perhaps it was the closeness she once shared with Naigi. Whatever the reason, she possessed an alertness that others lacked, but admiration has its dangers. The neighborhood women spoke about her constantly. Look at that girl, Meera, they would say to their daughters. See how she studies, how she helps her grandmother at kitchen. She said with no admiration, others with envy. Young boys watched her from street corners, whispering among themselves, and she was, the admiration to all. Every boy wants to be her love, and even certain older men who should have known better, allowed their gaze to linger too long. Mira sensed these things without fully understanding them. Her beauty had begun to enter the world before she was already for its consequences. The man who sang from the shadows, adolescence arrived quietly, like the slow opening of a flower that had not realized it was being watched. Across a narrow lane from Swami's bungalow, a new building was under construction. Concrete pillars rose slowly toward the sky. Laborers worked during the day. At night, the unfinished structures stood empty, its shadow stretching across the street like an unfinished thought. And it was from there the singing began. At first, Mira thought she had imagined young male voice drifting through the evening air, not particularly skilled but sincere. The song changed every few nights, sometimes old Tamil film songs, romantic, and sometimes melancholic, sometimes fragments of old poems, and sometimes simply her name whispered through the melodies, Mira. And she never saw him clearly at first, but she knew who was it. It was Prabha, the Malayali boy from 2 streets away. Among neighborhood gossip circles, he already carried a reputation: street Romeo, playful flirt, a boy who spent more time chasing girls instead of dreams than attending school. Yet there was something strangely innocent about the way he pursued her. He never approached her directly, never spoke to her in person. Instead, he existed at the edges of her awareness, a silhouette on the half-built terrace, a voice hidden behind concrete pillars. Sometimes small messages arrived through younger boys from the neighborhood. Anna, Prabha Anna says you should smile sometimes, or Anna wrote this poem for you. Mira never replied, but silence itself became a kind of conversation. At night, she lay awake, imagining the unseen singer, and what did he look like, and when he sang her name, did he truly mean those songs, or was it only youthful foolishness? She did not know, yet her heart had begun to respond to something unfamiliar. For the first time in her life, the disciplined world of responsibility, sharing space with the uncertain thrill of attention. The feeling frightened of her slightly, but it also made the evenings brighter. Then came Prabha, the Malayali boy next door, smart and street smart, playful, self-styled Romeo. He hid near the construction site, sent messages, and she imagined the conversations until they never had a chance to speak face to face. She started to admire his songs and his handsome and charming charismatic behavior. Though he seems to be the Romeo and love for all, he had a kind of attraction towards Mira, and that was noticed by one and all. She imagined conversation, futures, escape, and it was innocent until Mira's brother, cruel and controlling, spread rumors. Character assassination arrived swiftly, and Swami called her aside. Education first, dreams later. He did not shout, he advised, she obeyed, not because she did not love, but because she trusted his wisdom. Her eyes' dreams still flickered then. The rumor that changed everything, a tightly knit neighborhood. Love rarely remains secret for long. Someone always sees something, someone always speaks. One afternoon, Mira's older brother returned home with anger already burning in his voice. With what is this nonsense I hear about you? The accusation arrived suddenly. Mira stared at him in confusion. What nonsense are you talking? Don't pretend, he shouted. The whole street is talking about your romance with that useless fellow Prabha. The word struck her like cold water. Romance? She had never spoken to that boy, never even stood close enough to hear his voice clearly. But rumors are already concerned with truth. They feed on imagination. By evening, the story had traveled through the entire neighborhood. People spoke in lowered voice when she passed. Women exchanged knowing glances. The fragile dignity of a young girl had become public entertainment. When Swami heard of it, he did not react with anger. He called Mira into his study. The room smelled faintly of old books and sandalwood. He gestured for her to sit. For several moments, he simply observed her quietly. Then he spoke. Do you like that boy? The question startled her. No, Appa. Swami studied her face carefully. He was an experienced administrator. Years of interrogating dishonest officials had trained him to recognize deception, but his daughter's eyes held only confusion and embarrassment. He nodded slowly, listened carefully, Mira. His voice remained calm but firm. You are intelligent, you have a future far greater than the narrow life this street life this street imagines for you. She lowered her gaze. You must protect the future. The words carried both instruction and concern. Mira nodded obediently. Next evening, the singing stopped. Unfinished building stopped, stood silent. Prabha disappeared from the shadows as suddenly as he had appeared. But something important had already happened. For the first time, Mira had explained the dangerous intersection between innocence, attention, and reputation. A lesson society often teaches young girls with unnecessary cruelty. She returned fully to her studies. Her dreams expanded towards something larger, perhaps even the prestigious civil service career her father represented. But fate, which had been quietly watching her life unfold, had already prepared another path, a path far darker than the innocent songs of boy hiding in the unfinished building. Within months, another man who entered her life, and that meeting would change everything. And the part one interlude. Naigi, the quiet hearth. Before illness defined her, Naigi was warmth, not dramatic, not rebellious, but deeply alive in small sacred ways. And she woke before dawn, not because anyone ordered her, but because she loved the quiet hour when the house still breathed softly, oil lamp lit and rice washed, filter coffee brewed strong for Swami. Her joy was domestic but not dull. She hummed while grinding chutney and she arranged flowers with artistic symmetry. She plated food as though feeding guests even when it was only family. Love for Noigi was edible, a drift no one named. Her asthma did not announce itself as tragedy, it crept. Short breaths while claiming stays, fatigue after childbirth, and sleepless nights coughing into a sari so children would not wake. 5 pregnancies in 10 years hollowed her strength. Outsiders call it laziness, sloth. She moves slowly, she sleeps in the afternoon, but exhaustion is not sloth, it is depletion. And Swami, pragmatic and task oriented, began interrupting her slowing pace as emotional withdrawal. She began interpreting his long silence as disapproval. The drift was not loud, it was incremental. It neither stopped caring, they simply stopped reaching. The kitchen as a kingdom, if marriage felt fragile, the kitchen felt sovereign. She cooked not as obligation but as expression. Rasam tailored to Swami's preference when he returned from tours. Extra ghee on the children's rice during exam days, soft idlis of her mother in law, Rukmani, whose teeth had weakened, and food was a language of apology, her reassurance, her proof of presence. Even on days when her lungs burned and limbs trembled, she insisted on stirring the pot herself. Sit, Rukmani would say gently, but Naigi would smile. I don't cook. If I don't cook, how will they taste my love? Rukmani, the silent ally. Rukmani's warmest mother-in-law to Naigi, was not the stereotypical tyrant of household tales. She had known hardship, widowhood, scarcity, and also she recognized illness when she saw it. At first, she watched Nike carefully measuring obedience, discipline, skill, but over time, she saw the breathlessness, the way Nike leaned against walls when no one was looking, the faint tremor in her hands, and she never humiliated her. Instead, she balanced quietly. If Nike could not stand long, Rukmini finished her seasoning. If children demanded attention, she distracted them with stories, and if Swami's expectation rose, she moderated gently. Let her rest, she would tell her son. She is not made of iron. Their relationship was built not on confrontation but cooperation. Naigi remained obedient not from fear but from respect. Rukmini remained supportive not from indulgence but from understanding. Between them, the house held. A marriage with a hairline crack, Swami loved order, Naigi embodied emotion. And when she slowed down, he grew patient. When he grew stern, she retreated. But they never had disrespected each other publicly. Arguments were low, voice distance was subtle. At night, sometimes Swami would notice her coughing and turn away, not because he did not care, but because helplessness irritated him. He could solve administrative crises. He could confront ministers. He could not command her lungs to breathe. That impotence created frustration. She sensed it and felt guilty for her own illness. So she compensated with care, extra chutney, pressed clothes ready, children disciplined softly so he would not raise his voice. Love became service, not romance, the house that did not break. And despite the rift between husband and wife, the family did not fracture because three forces held together. Commitment, divorce was unthinkable. Children, their laughter bridged awkward silences, and Rukmani's balance, she buffered extremes. Swami remained dedicated, working tirelessly for stability. Nagi remained nurturing, sustaining emotional climate. Rukmini remained grounding, preventing collapse. It was not a fairy tale marriage, it was functional ecosystem. Naige's inner prayer in quiet moments when the house slept, Naige would sit near the tulasi plant and whisper, "Let my children not feel the cracks between us." She did not pray for passion, she prayed for continuity. Even his body body weakened, her commitment did not. She existed not passively but intentionally for children, for society, for husband, and for the family, for the promise she had made, the unseen heroism. History remembers men like Swami, decorated, upright, transferred for integrity, but houses survived because of women like Nagi. She did not transform the world, she prevented a world from collapsing, and sometimes that is a great strength. The seed of the future, that knowledge would remain inside Meera for the rest of her life. It would influence the man she trusted, the man she chose, the man who would later break her heart, because childhood observations are like seeds buried deep within memory. They grow slowly, silently, until one day they become the forest through which the entire life must walk. And that is the end of part one, the life of Nayagi and Swami. And now let's move on to part two. The part two, it is the life that started the negotiated illusion between Meera and Rajiv.